Hey, Peaceniks. I'd like to thank Twiggy Baranches for our intro and outro music. And a quick shout out to our sponsor, Crim Hemp Cigarettes from sugarcali.com. Finally, a hemp cigarette that doesn't taste like shit. That's their motto, and I couldn't agree more that they do not taste like shit. If you're trying to kick tobacco, or if you enjoy the occasional smoke with coffee or an alcoholic beverage like I do, but you avoid tobacco for the same reason you would avoid sticking your head in a microwave oven, try a hemp cigarette. They have my favorite, good old Original. They have vanilla and mint. Go to sugarcali.com, orders over $25, get free shipping, and enter the offer code PEACE15 at checkout to receive 15% off your order, and they throw a little cash our way here at the Peace on Drugs podcast. All right. Today's guest is Katinka Van De Ven. She is a PhD, doctorate in cultural and global criminology, and she does research in harm reduction, but with a unique twist on this topic that is so common on this podcast. She specializes in harm reduction in PIDS. You'll hear us say it a few times in the episode. It's acronym PEIDS. This acronym stands for Performance Enhancing and Image Enhancing Drugs, steroids. This is a new and interesting spin on the drug war because it's rarely talked about, and I myself knew very little about this world. So if it's new to you, it was new to me too, and I honestly wasn't sure how it was going to go, but it went swimmingly, and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Her enthusiasm was contagious. She loves what she does, you can tell. And I know you're going to enjoy this. Let's dive in.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
Drugs are menacing our society.
What are your thoughts on the drug problem?
I had a great time doing drugs.
So tonight, from our family to yours, from our home to yours, thank you for joining us.
This is the Peace on Drugs.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great, it's all working at the first try. Nice to finally meet you, eh? Jeez, everything could go wrong and went wrong.
I know. Great to meet you. Katinka, thank you for being on here.
Thank you. So, how are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
Yeah, also good. Finally, fully recovered and, fully back at work.
That's good to hear. And because you had COVID, right?
Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, we were pretty sick, unfortunately.
Not good.
You not get COVID.
No, it's not fun. We got it early in 2020, and no, it's not fun.
You were very sick as well.
It didn't get in our respiratory, my wife and I, but it did. It was like having the flu.
Yeah.
But we had the weird dizzy spells for weeks afterwards. It was strange.
Yeah, I heard that from quite some people. We just had like the extreme tiredness for a couple of weeks, but I finally, it seems I finally feel fully better again. But it's pretty intense.
Yeah, I'm glad you're better. That's really good.
Good.
So we asked you to be on the podcast. My assistant and I, he found you and you work in harm reduction in performance enhancing and image enhancing drugs, correct?
Yeah, that's fully correct. Yeah.
That's interesting because for our podcast, my main focus is on the war on drugs, and psychoactive drugs have been the biggest thing that we talk about. So this is something that's a little different that we're not used to talking about, something that I don't know a lot about, but I'm interested in it because I've done a lot of talk with harm reduction, but nothing with harm reduction in performance or image enhancing drugs. And I'm curious what that field looks like versus Well, to be honest, I'm happy that you also bring it up because it is usually overlooked not just when it comes to harm reduction, but generally with drug policy, performance and image enhancing drug in generally is often ignored. I can talk a little bit about that. I don't know if you already officially are recording or if you. Okay. It's kind of laid back, and anything we want to cut out, we can. But usually, we just go with it, go with the flow.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So, one of the things which adds to why it, usually doesn't tend to have a priority is that we don't compared to other psychoactive substances, is that we don't, for example, see people overdosing on the street from these kind of substances, or people who use anabolic steroids are not necessarily becoming super violent and punching holes or punching people. So it's not necessarily that you see the direct harms like you see compared to other substances. And then also, there's a lot of issues with the research currently out there that looks at the prevalence of steroid use, but there is also, very little work in that area. But the work that does exist shows that it's not extremely high. Like it's between, there's this review that looked at the prevalence, in different countries, and it usually is between 1% and 3%. But what is interesting, and I think that's also where the harm reduction perspective comes from, is that we actually have other indicators that potentially show that this issue is bigger than we are currently, necessarily seeing with concrete facts from research. And especially what we see is that, especially in Australia and in the UK, is that we see an increased growth of people attending needle and syringe programs of people who use anabolic steroids. I do want to have a quick note, by the way, is that we usually use the terms performance and image enhancing drugs. And that involves a range of different substances, that can be anabolic steroids, can be weight loss drugs, can be human growth hormone. But the main focus, the main drug substance that we're focused on in general is anabolic steroids. That is because that's usually the main type of performance and image enhancing drugs that we see that is being used. That's also probably because the research is mainly focused on that type of substance. But we tend to use the words, I'm going to just use the acronym PEDS, because what we see is that anabolic steroid users often are using other enhancement drugs in addition to their steroid use, and they use those kind of substances so either to increase effects in terms of performance and image enhancing, either to counteract some of the side effects that they potentially can experience from substances, or also potentially just for recreational reasons. So during this podcast, I probably often will refer to anabolic steroids. So if we're talking about adverse effects, I will tend to focus on anabolic steroids because other performance enhancing substances would come with other adverse effects. So I think that is really important to usually mention upfront that is the main substance that we're talking about here. So just coming. Oh.
And anabolic steroids, I believe, are Schedule 3 in our country. Are they outlawed in your country as well?
Yeah, so it depends a bit on the jurisdiction here in Australia. But for example, New South Wales, where I'm located, it's a Schedule 1 drugs. So it's seen on the same level as the way, for example, heroin is criminalized. So the possession and use is criminalized here as well, where you can get up to 25 years in prison.
Wow.
And that also applies to some of the other states. So potentially, I believe it's also the case in Queensland and Victoria as well. So it depends on as I said, a bit on the jurisdiction. And what is really interesting is that we also, so what we tend to see actually, because of talking about the war on drugs, is that actually when it comes to other substances, especially cannabis, I guess, we see movement. We see moving away from criminalization. So we see, in countries where they're decriminalizing, legalizing it, and not necessarily only for cannabis. We see that also with other substances as well, which is, a great movement. But actually, when we look at anabolic steroids and other enhancement drugs, is that we actually see that it tends to be, policies tend to become tougher. So, I think on the top of my head, I think that in New South Wales and Queensland, the law changed in around 2015, and it went to a Schedule 1 drug in that year. But we also see, for example, in other countries where anti-doping policies basically are adapted to deal with the recreational use of steroids within fitness and bodybuilding and so on. And I mean that in generally that's still occurs on a low scale. So for example, in Belgium, if you go to the gym, you can get can get a doping control. So you can get tested for anabolic steroids. And if you then test positive, you have to pay usually a fine, you get banned from the gym. And actually the police is also allowed to start a criminal investigation based looking at the supply of these kind of substances. But going back to my original point.
I'm sorry, so make sure I got this right. You're saying in Belgium,
Yeah.
they actually can test you for drugs at your own gym?
Yeah. So so they can test you for so there they've adopted anti-doping policies to target recreational trainers, which I don't think
if you're a trainer, not if it's like your gym, you're going like if you work for the gym.
No. Sorry. I use the that's communication, the language issue here. No, I mean everyone who attends a gym. Whether
really, so like I could go to my gym and it could pull me aside and say you have to take this test to see if you're on steroids.
Yeah.
That
exactly.
is insane. Wow. Holy shit. It's weird too, because I'm the war on drugs I focus on with the psychoactive substances. That seems so much more of the propaganda that we're fed, at least in our country. When it comes to the enhancement drugs, we don't really hear about it at all. There's not propaganda, with the exception of in sports. If you hear about it on ESPN, if a sports person, somebody in the sports tested it, but you don't hear about it in the regular communities of people at the gym.
No, exactly. Although I feel, but maybe that's also because I'm so focused in this on my research. I do feel that we do hear more about it in terms of bodybuilding, and there have been recent famous bodybuilders who have died on a relatively young age in relation to cardiovascular issues, a heart attack or so on. So we do see a bit of more focus in that sense. But I agree with you, and that and usually people don't tend to really be aware of these kind of things unless it is focused on professional sports. And if you ask about anabolic steroids, everybody also tends to think about the huge bodybuilder at the gym who is using these substances to increase in muscle size. But actually, what's really interesting is that definitely in bodybuilding populations, these substances are used, but actually we see a lot of other, groups of people where they would use these substances as well. So, for example, these kind of substances are also more popular among older men, but not necessarily to increase muscle size, but more so for anti-aging reasons. So, as you grow older, your natural testosterone production goes down. So we actually see men who potentially cannot get it via a legal route, like testosterone replacement therapy via a doctor, would go then to the black markets to access steroids and then use it for anti-aging reasons. We also see it in cultures like professions like security personnel, police, the military, where these kind of substances potentially can have a benefit in terms of having increased muscle size or muscle strength, but also in terms of steroids. Everybody always thinks of muscle, increase of muscle mass, but actually they can also help with preventing injury or quicker recovery from injury, but of course potentially would be very beneficial if you're in the military and have to constantly perform on a very high level. So, there's different populations where we actually see these kind of substances. And there's even women who use these substances as well, but I have to say that in general, that is in a much lower, rate than, for example, compared to men. So yeah, there's a lot of, different, I guess, typologies, groups that are using these kind of substances as opposed to just, the big bodybuilder.
Yeah. And these substances, do they actually help you heal faster too from like sports injuries, or are they just specifically for growing muscles?
No. Yeah. So as I said, so it will help with quicker recovery from injury or the prevention of injury as well. Yeah.
So soldiers can benefit, and people that come back from from being in the military or from training exercises that are too strenuous can use them for those things.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually really interesting. I recently, it's currently in press, wrote an article with a colleague, Professor Adrian Walsh, about the use of steroids within the military. And it's an ethical piece, and then looking into different advantages and disadvantages of potentially using substances within the military. And it's not necessarily in that sense new, because the military is, looking historically has, experimented with substances to potentially aid, their people within the military. And in that sense, steroids, because you're exactly right, could potentially help with recovery or with prevention of injuries, could potentially be beneficial, or even also the increase of muscle strength, right? In terms of being stronger is definitely something that is beneficial for if you have to go to war. And but there comes other issues as well, because we do see. People think there is a bit of this myth about, a roid rage. So people, that the idea that people all of a sudden, can get super violent because of using steroids, and have therefore, killed someone, or, have committed violent acts in some way, of shape, or form. That doesn't really exist. But what we do see when we look at studies on steroids and aggression is that potentially, it can increase a bit of, the feeling of aggression. And if you then look at the military, if you have to make a split second decision whether or not you need to pull the trigger, having, potentially increased feelings of aggression could potentially influence that decision. So it was really interesting looking at different perspectives as to why steroids potentially should not be used within the military. But anyway, so to answer your question, it definitely could have certain benefits.
And also I see the same thing with psychoactive substances. The people that go crazy and become extremely violent, and it takes 5 cops to restrain them. These stories are also majorly overblown. It's very uncommon for people even on those drugs. Alcohol actually is the most dangerous.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Especially when we look at studies that have looked at steroids and aggression, it's usually, when they then look at factors that influence it, usually what comes up is that alcohol actually is the main culprit. And I mean, it's also, if you look at things of personality. So if you have a more aggressive personality by nature, using steroids can, of course, enhance that. So I completely. Well,
also it just makes you stronger. So if you're already going to be aggressive, being stronger is going to be more dangerous. But that's also just somebody lifting weights could be more dangerous without the steroids if they're already prone to being violent. So
exactly. Yes, exactly. Good point. So it's very interesting. But I wanted to say, by the way, and actually, because we're currently thinking a bit about these different categories, right? About, you always have psychoactive substances, and then you have performance and image enhancing drugs, and there's this separation between different things. But actually and that's because initially we were really focused on steroids, where, that is more used for enhancement reasons than necessary, recreational reasons. You're not using steroids to get relaxed in the afternoon after a busy day of work. Do you know what I mean? But actually, when we think about it, a lot of substances, also psychoactive substances, are actually used for enhancements. So, for example, think of cocaine, which is, generally thought of as a party drug. It's also used to lose weight, for example. So, which would then be an image enhancement reason for using these kind of substances. So we're actually at the moment having a lot of discussions with colleagues in the field about thinking a bit more broadly about these different categories and how substances fit within the enhancement drugs category.
Well, amphetamines are used by militaries across the world for the same purposes, right?
Yeah, and modafinil is used also when you're looking at staying awake in the military as well, and is also sometimes used to suppress appetite and so on. So there's lots of different substances that are used for different reasons. So I think it's really important when we think of research not to necessarily, having categories helps. Having, it is good to know in terms of prevalence, or, if you want to develop a certain health or harm reduction policy, it's good to have categories. But it also hinders us because we potentially ignore things that are really important to consider as well. So lots of going on in this field at the moment.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that, so the dangers of, let me ask you this, how dangerous are the regular use of anabolic steroids? First of all, just for us, how dangerous are they? But also compared to, say, somebody who, because these are typically people that are healthy, right? They're people that want to build muscle, want to go to the gym. And when I think of drug users and harm reduction programs, most people think of somebody who's barely getting by. They're not healthy. They're not living a healthy lifestyle, but they have mental problems and they're shooting heroin. These are people that are at the gym working out, trying to better themselves, but they're using supplements with anabolic steroids to build muscle. How dangerous is that versus, say, not working out and eating McDonald's every day?
So actually, you're hitting on a lot of points. So I have to try to remember to come back to all the other things. So first of all, you're right. I mean, when I talk to a lot of people who use steroids, they will come exactly with that argument, like, compared to other people who sit on the couch, eat a bag of chips, I'm much healthier because I go to the gym, I work out, I pay attention to, my nutrition. So, what are people, worried or anxious about when it comes to steroid use, right? So, and you could make that argument, you could wonder what someone who is obese and, would compare those to someone who goes to the gym, has a good nutrition, but uses steroids, how they would potentially would be doing, and probably the person who's using steroids is probably better off than the person who's severely obese. And so also if we look at research, so you're probably familiar with, where they have ranked the different kind of substances of Professor David Nutt. So, they've done that research in the UK, but they've done that in Europe and other countries. And I mean, there's several criticisms on the methodology used. But so those points aside, what we do see is every time that steroids get ranked, they really score low in terms of individual harms and also social harm. So we don't necessarily see, for example, a lot of harm socially in terms of, people committing crimes to get money to be able to support their use. We also don't necessarily see quite, a lot of individual harms directly, like people overdosing, as I said before, and so on. So we do see that compared to other drugs, they usually tend to score relatively low in terms of harms. But having said that, I mean, of course, there is harms with, using any substance. If you would compare someone who doesn't use compared to someone who does use, the person who does use have certain risks because they're using a substance. And especially what we do see, and I think that's also very difficult to talk about with people, using these substances, and especially young men, is the long-term effects. So we do see increasingly research that it has impact on your cardiovascular health. We also see risks in terms of impacting on the brain. And we also see psychological issues. And that has specifically to do with, people having difficulty stopping this use. And so I'm just trying to think about how to say this in the best possible way. But so what happens is, so when you start using steroids, right? And if I'm not allowed to use these words on the podcast, I can reframe it, or you can just cut this part out. So but what I always explain to people who start using steroids is that all of a sudden, you get this external testosterone and steroids in your body, right? So your body thinks all of a sudden, oh wow, I get this external testosterone. So basically what happens is that your balls go on a holiday because they're like, oh, I don't have to produce this myself anymore because I'm getting all this external stuff in my body, right? So what then happens usually is that when people stop using, potentially can take a while before that process starts up again, before your natural production of testosterone starts up again. And in some cases, but that is more in the minority, it even doesn't start up at all anymore. Really? But it can take up weeks to months for that process to start up again. So, and what happens during that time that you're not producing that your natural testosterone anymore is that when you feel highly, it can be that you feel depressed, feel anxious. You also see a loss in muscle. So that's where, dependence can occur, because a lot of people, because they want to avoid those feelings, or because they, because of the feeling, or because of the muscle loss, start using again because they want to avoid that. So what happens also, what we see more and more, where we, used to be, back in the 90s, we really had people would use steroids, which was called an on cycle for several weeks, and then they would have what is called an off cycle. So people would stop using for several weeks. To reduce the risk of side effects. But what we're seeing now is that people don't stop using anymore. So what is happening is that they will have an on cycle, but instead of stopping, they potentially will reduce their steroid use, which of course increases the risks, that are associated with steroid use as well. And that comes also back to the point that you raised about, the healthy bodybuilder, because this person is, training a lot, this person pays attention to their nutrition a lot. But this group is also potentially at highest risk of developing adverse effects because they often use in such high quantities. So, they're using high quantities, they're using often multiple steroids at once, they're not taking breaks anymore. So those are the groups, they have certain risks because they're using in so much quantities. There's actually a really interesting Danish study that looked at the different typologies of steroid users, where they looked at, use versus risks and who potentially would be also at more risk. And what we also see is especially young men who use steroids, who sometimes with their first cycle will use like these massive doses and, multiple steroids because they have read that online somewhere. And actually, to be honest, like if you're a first-time user, just using a little bit of testosterone would already give you, massive gains without necessarily being worried about the side effects. But those people are usually more at risk because those young users are also often polydrug users, so they will use, recreational substances as well. So it depends a bit on the type of user, but what kind of risks are associated with that. So you have to take different things in consideration when you're, looking at different populations when it comes to risks and how to best support them. And for example, what is really interesting in terms of risk, when we look at young users, they tend to use more oral steroids because they are, injecting steroids is a bit of a more scary step, having to stick a needle in yourself. But actually, oral steroids are much more toxic to the liver. So, which can potentially be dangerous. But on the other hand, although injecting steroids is less toxic on the liver, you potentially have the risks of, getting infections, risk of bloodborne virus and so on. So, there's different risks, different things that you need to consider depending on the group that you're focusing on.
Well, it sounds like very similar with the legal psychoactive market. With a lot of people don't start with shooting; they start with taking them. But one of the things is if it was legal and they were able to go to a doctor, the doctor could explain this. The injectable version would not be as dangerous if it was controlled in a legal setting, right? Because the problems you're talking about with injectables are on an illegal market where there's no needle exchanges. And then also some of the other risks, and I'm not saying that like you've laid out a lot of risks, and personally, like I would stay away from those, but I would also be a hypocrite because I've went to some psychoactive drugs, but it's an individual's choice, right? So if we let the people make their choice, the best thing we can do is give them honest information and have a doctor explain them. You can use them, but here's what potentially could happen, and that's what harm reduction basically is, right? Is trying to get that information out there. And do you have needle exchanges in Australia?
Yeah, exactly. And one of the issues here is that because steroid use, people who use steroids, needle exchange programs are the main healthcare, service where people who use steroids go to. And because of that, which on the one hand is good because we see harm reduction in Australia and especially in the UK as well, increasing about trying to offer services for people who use steroids, but it also comes a bit with a downfall. And the downfall is that actually when we look at research, we see that things like sharing needles is very low amongst this population, and that's potentially there's actually other risks, unprotected sex, that are potentially more of an issue within this population than necessarily the risk of bloodborne virus. But the problem is because they're presenting at needle syringe programs, is that we see that is the main focus. So when we look at the development of harm reduction materials, it's like all about, don't share your needles, and the risk and explaining the risk of bloodborne virus. But actually, when we then talk with people who use steroids, they say, this is not really an issue within, I'm not sharing my needles and making sure that I'm doing it in the safest way as possible. And because of that, but they have other medical needs that are not being addressed. So what tends to happen is that they will go to needle syringe programs, pick up the needles, but then are not necessarily interested in the information that is provided there. So we do need to expand the things that we're focusing on when it comes to this population. And one of the issues is that historically, and unfortunately that still occurs, is that people who go to doctors because they potentially want support, because they're experiencing adverse effects, or because they want information, where the doctor is usually very negative and not willing to support this person and just basically says, you have to stop using and that's it. So, a lot of my research is actually improving healthcare access for people who use steroids, and especially also targeted at general practitioners. And because one of the issues is why they're not really supporting this group is because they also have relatively low knowledge when it comes to the substances, because they are, more aware of people who use other, recreational drugs. There's a lot of treatment and service. Well, not a lot. I mean, there's still, of course, what needs to happen in that space, but there is more knowledge around it. But if they get a very muscular man in their, waiting room, they don't really necessarily know what to do with this group. So what also is really important is also acknowledging that steroids work, because there was also a very long time that doctors would say that steroids didn't do anything, where, now research has also clearly shown, that steroids definitely can increase muscle mass and size. So, that's one of the issues, is that, there's very little healthcare access for this group, or when they go, they have experienced very negative experiences. So we definitely, that is something that we definitely need to improve when it comes to this group. So there is some harm reduction going on, but it's very limited information as to what people who use steroids are interested in. And that's what I wanted to say. So what happens now, instead of going to a doctor to get, potentially a bit more balanced information, or, information more about the medical effects, is that potentially their main information source is what is called bro science. So they get the information via online forums, via their buddies at the gym. And that's not to say that information is necessarily incorrect. I'm sometimes amazed by what these people know. It's like, they know exactly how every steroid works, exactly what way, how they work in combination with other substances and so on. And, and that's great. But what you do miss is, well, first of all, usually the positive sides are, exaggerated, and then the negative sides are a bit put aside. But also, in the end, you don't know what is going on internally. So, to really know what is happening to your body, you will need to get tests done by a doctor, who then can actually say actually, I see here some, in terms of your liver, there's a lot of toxicity going on. Are you using oral steroids? And that potentially could be a harm reduction measure, that if someone is, not willing to stop yet, or doesn't want to stop, that you could say, okay, if you continue using, potentially stop your oral steroids, because that is really damaging your body right now. Yeah,
I'm seeing a lot of parallels with the other harm reduction within psychoactive drugs, and just that if you could have an honest relationship with your doctor about what you're doing to your body, your doctor could actually help you. But there's so much, surreptitious kind of movements within the communities of what they think they're allowed to say, or what they're allowed to convey to a doctor. And a doctor, at least in our country, a doctor can't even help you if you're an addict. They can't give you the proper prescriptions. They have to send you to abstinence-only programs. So I think that if you could just open up those doors between a doctor and their patient, and allow, an honest discussion about what people are putting into their bodies, like you said, then you can really see what's going on. And if somebody wanted to use steroids, they would be much safer in a legal form.
But the problem is that that's the discussion also that we constantly have with not just necessarily doctors, but also other health professionals, is that line. Doctors are really worried if I give them harm reduction advice that it comes across as if I'm condoning their use. But you can still say, give a message where it is clear that you're not necessarily condoning their use, but that you can have, just as you said, an honest discussion saying if you continue to use these substances, be aware that these kind of things can happen. Or, we have currently, we have done tests, and this is currently happening to your body. So I would advise you to either, do this if you're not able to stop yet. And also what we see usually is that when a doctor is more honest and has an more open conversation, is that people who use these substances actually are more willing to listen to a doctor and also potentially take up their advice. So if they potentially won't stop using, they might start using less, or less different types of steroids, which is already a big win, right? Mm-hmm. And actually, one of the things that we see from research amongst this group is that, I don't know the percentages on top of my head anymore, but one of the issues is that a lot of people who do want to stop have difficulty stopping and usually tend to go back on using steroids. And I think that's a group that definitely can use our help. So if you have a good relationship with your doctor who, is honest about it, then you're also more likely to reach that person and to be able to support that person when they decide, okay, I do want to stop using, and a doctor can then, or another healthcare professional can then potentially support that person with stopping their use. Mm-hmm.
And that happens a lot with once a heroin addict gets a regular regimen of heroins, like in a country like Switzerland, where they're on a schedule, they know when they're getting the heroin, they know the purity, and they're getting counseling. A lot of them will actually quit and get better because what they were dealing with was not the heroin, it was other problems in their life. And once they get their life back together, they can then deal with the heroin. And this is why this is an interesting topic or podcast for me, because there are so many parallels that I never thought of before, but I don't know, it's because it's a mental health thing with the heroin. If you're just trying, I mean, I guess it is very similar in that your body image issues, you're getting jacked at the gym. And then if you quit taking them, you're going to lose some of that. So it becomes an issue of, self-image and how you feel about yourself. And so it is mental as well in a way.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Actually, really interesting is also that we do see that some research is done amongst heroin users as well, where they see that they use these steroids as well. Either once they stop heroin use, they will start using steroids because they want to increase their muscle mass again, or in some cases actually use it to hide their heroin use, to make sure that their body that they don't lose too much muscle mass and too much weight. But anyway, that was a bit of a sidetrack. I agree. There is a lot of, but I think that's the thing. There's a lot of parallels, but there's also differences as well. And I mean, people who use steroids also, well, I do find interesting, experience discrimination in that sense that where you said in the beginning, usually these people look healthy. They usually have an education. They usually have a job. So a lot of healthcare professionals are like, why would I help you? You are healthy, you have an education, you have a job. If you want help, you just simply can stop. Whereas someone, for example, who's has a heroin addiction, as you said, potentially that person is homeless, has no job, and potentially there's other issues going on where there is much more potentially support needed compared to someone who's using steroids. Having said that, though, anyone who needs help or experience adverse effects should have access to healthcare if they need it. I mean, that's also the point. If someone is obese, you also don't simply say, stop eating, lose weight. There's lots of things in place where we can stop, where we can support people who are obese to potentially, help them with the issues that they're experiencing that are caused by their obesity, but also there's a lot of things in place for them that can help them support becoming healthier. So, why wouldn't we do that with someone who's using steroids, for example?
Yeah, and I do see what you're saying, though, where if someone looks like they're doing really well, then it's that natural instinct to want to help somebody isn't there, because like I'm more looking for advice from you. How do you look so good?
Yeah. Exactly.
But I did read on one of the articles I was reading for this was that 59% of people that injected anabolic steroids or just how do you say it, performance enhancing, image enhancing drugs. 59% also use psychoactive drugs. And I'm curious, in Australia, what percentage of people just in general population use psychoactive drugs? Do you know? I'm not.
Oh, yeah. So do you mean like how many steroid users will use psychoactive?
No, just of the general population in Australia. Do you know about what percentage of people use drugs? I honestly, I do this podcast and I'm asking, like, I should have looked that up and I didn't have an answer for my own country. I want to say it's less than 59% though. I think it's a lot less. And that's not, that's because they won't include alcohol though. Of course, if you include alcohol, I would imagine it's probably around 59% or more, but
I mean, it's definitely lower than that. I mean, and it also depends on the type of substance. But I do not know on the top of my head exactly what the prevalence numbers are in relation to psychoactive substances. So I owe you that answer. But I mean, the 59% among steroid users. How do you say? That's not a. How do you say? That is a.
That's high. It's a high number compared to the.
Yeah, but that's also because, it's not a prevalence study. You're looking at a specific high-risk group, potentially, I don't know exactly what study that is, maybe bodybuilders, where potentially a lot of use will already be going on. So it's a very targeted study.
I see what you're saying. So, it's not all people using the steroids. It's just the people that were in the study that were on steroids. So they might
exactly.
I got you.
Yeah. But I mean, to come to that point, what we do see increasingly more and more is where initially, back in the day, where, people who use steroids were mainly using steroids and, things like human growth hormone and really would stay away from even alcohol and also a psychoactive drug. Nowadays, we do see more and more that there is a lot of polydrug use going on, so that a lot of people who use steroids will also use recreational substances as well. So there is a bit of a development there in terms of what kind of substances people will use, people who use steroids will use in addition to that as well.
Gotcha. And I was just wondering if that had more to do with the fact that they're already doing something illegal, so it opens up that door, or if it's more that people that are in sports and prone to sports activities and injuries can also self-medicate with things like cannabis. Because I do jujitsu, and jujitsu, a lot of the people in the classes, cannabis is huge in that community. And these are people that are go-getters and want to, but they use cannabis because they're constantly aching from doing all this work, and it helps them.
Yeah, exactly. But there's a lot of discussion going on. Well, not a lot, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there's discussion going on in terms of the professional sport context as well, where, we see, a relatively high use of painkillers as well, because, they need to be dealing with injuries, but they also, need to constantly be performing on this high level, where there is this discussion as to whether or not it should be better for them to move on to cannabis because of, potentially having milder adverse effects compared to using painkillers all the time. But I mean, the fact is that cannabis in general in the sport context is not allowed to be used, where painkillers, you can get a prescription from a doctor and justify why it's being used within a professional sport context. So there is actually some discussion going on that as well. But you're right, like we do see when we look at professional sports, or even, high levels of bodybuilding, is that, they will use recreational substances either for dealing with pain, but also to sleep better, for example, as well. So, there's so much overlap in that as well. And also where, when we look at the supply, we do see some movements in there as well, where, people who supplied, illegally supplied these substances were potentially initially would focus more so on, just supplying steroids and other enhancement substances that come with it. We now see that, that is expanding a bit more, that they're dealing in other substances as well.
Also, it's the gateway. The reason marijuana cannabis is such a gateway, or called a gateway, is because when you're young and you go to a cannabis dealer, or you call it a pot dealer, then you go to your pot dealer, they might have Xanax or something else. And that's how it became, because it was illegal, it became a gateway. So you're saying the same thing with the steroids. You go to your steroid dealer, they might have something else on the menu.
Yeah, exactly. Which then potentially can help, whether that is for image or performance enhancement, or if it is just purely for recreational users. But I mean, so I've also done a lot of research on the supply as well. And I mean, one of the reasons why initially people would just focus on, supplying steroids is because it doesn't have any priority when it comes to the police. So, we, in that sense, it has less priority because we see, for example, less violence coming from this market and so on. So it made a lot of sense actually for suppliers to just focus on this, because they know that police wouldn't necessarily focus on it.
Well, that actually was one of the questions I had, was what does the black market look like in this industry? So you're saying it's not as violent and it's not quite the same as the psychoactive drug black market.
Yeah, so actually what we do see, I mean, there's increasing research on this. And actually, one of the things that anti-doping officials often have claimed is that organized crime groups are like basically owning this market and supplying it to professional athletes and bodybuilders. But actually really interesting is that when we look at the research that it does exist on the supply of these substances, is that we constantly see that organized crime groups play a small role. So, I mean, yes, of course, there will be, bikie gangs that will be dealing in steroids as well. But in general, we see that they're not necessarily the main supplier of these kind of steroids. And I mean, there's two reasons also potentially that relate to this is, first of all, it's relatively easy to make your own steroids. So you can order raw materials from China, that gets important to your country, and then it's relatively easy to turn that into either a tablet or an injectable. So, we see that what is called, underground labs, we see those potentially increasing in countries like in Australia. There are some indications that underground labs are potentially increasing. So in that sense, it is easy, as I said, for people to just make it themselves. But also there is this mix of, this being a legal substance as well. So, testosterone, you can get prescribed via, for example, for testosterone replacement therapy. So we actually see that also sometimes doctors will be involved in this as well. So they will potentially prescribe these testosterone without necessarily being a medical indication as well. And I mean, then there's, of course, like other substances, the online market. We don't necessarily, so a lot of actually what is, a lot of it is being sold, but, via the open web. And that is because, on the dark web, the steroids are also sold as well. But because steroids have less priority, there is less need to really go to the dark web to supply these kinds of substances. So you actually see a lot of them being sold via just, regular websites as well. And I mean, so there's different ways of being, able to access these kind of substances. And I mean, from what we see in this area, but I mean, research is limited on this. We do see not a lot of violence occurring within this market.
Gotcha. And I do remember actually when you brought that up, I had a friend, or a person I knew that used steroids, and I watched him order it online. It wasn't the dark web, just went to this website. It was a weird website, and I scrolled through all the stuff looking for psychoactive drugs to see what else they had. They had none of that. It was just steroids and other enhancement drugs, but it was all illegal, but order it and it's sent right to his house.
Yeah, no, exactly. The only thing, though, is one of the problems is that we do see that the quality of steroids via the black market is pretty low. So every research that I also tested steroids. I got steroids from dealers, from users, from authorities, and then tested those different the steroids. And what we do see is, for example, is that they're often underdosed. That's not necessarily dangerous, but you're just not getting paid. You're not getting what you paid for. Sometimes they're overdosed, but also what we see is that there is an active steroid ingredient in there. But what we see is that it's not necessarily the steroid that is mentioned on the vial. What it actually is, it almost seems like the person who was producing this was at home, looked at the shelf, and was like, "What do I have left?" And then just like puts it all in.
Oh, wow.
And because steroid is in that sense, steroid is a steroid in a sense. So people would, still experience, increased muscle mass or strength from it. So they wouldn't necessarily question the quality of these substances. So that's really interesting to see as well. But So I wanted to say something about that as well, but I forgot. Anyway.
Well, I was just thinking like the idea that the drugs are less potent than they're supposed to be, like you said, that's not as harmful. That's actually what you see in the black market with psychoactive drugs. Most drugs like cocaine you're getting like only 30% purity in cocaine. But the problem is then every once in a while, an addict gets the one that is super potent and they do the same amount and it kills them. And I think in the steroid market, it won't kill you, but it's not good for your body to do different doses and not know constantly what you're getting.
Exactly. And especially also if we think of female users where there is, certain effects, that are irreversible. So, change of voice and the more masculine effects that you can experience.
These are irreversible when they happen. I didn't know that.
Well, when they're using on a long term, it's not necessarily right away irreversible, but in some cases it can be irreversible. So if you're using very high quantities and are not aware of that, it potentially can have much more significant effects on your body than if you're using, if you're thinking that you're using a very low dose. So, but you're right. You don't have that, direct effect that you potentially could overdose of having too much steroids in your body. But yeah.
Let's face it, I do think that the worst thing that could probably happen to a steroid user, I mean, the worst thing would be death, I think. But one of the worst things would be being arrested and spending 25 years in prison. But
I mean, I said that, but I mean, again, not a lot of research. At the moment, it's a bit unknown to what extent people are actually getting convicted. So we did see in Australia that since the law has changed, that in New South Wales and Queensland, the arrest rate for people using these substances has gone massively up. But what we don't know is to what extent people then are actually convicted for it. I'm trying to get some research going to do some more research on that. But yeah, at the moment, that's a bit of an unknown area.
Even being arrested for it. And this is the same thing with any personal choice that somebody makes. And everybody makes the argument, well, if you're selling drugs, it's different. I agree it's different if you're making money off of it. But most people selling drugs are doing it to support the habit that they're addicted to. Yeah. But I just think that if the punishment's worse than what the thing does to you, then it's not, then the punishment's, it shouldn't be a punishment. I mean, and that's.
No, and I exactly agree. And I mean, I definitely don't think it should be a Schedule I drugs. I find it so hard, in terms of thinking about, okay, how should it be regulated? Because, every model has it benefits and downfalls, whether decriminalization, legalization, there's always issues. For example, on one extent, I'm thinking, considering the low harms, considering people should have individual choice, should we maybe legalize this aspect? But then if you, for example, look at the model in California, where, it's now being advertised and marketed, and actually we do see there, from what I understand, is that, prevalence rates has gone up, adverse effects has gone up as well, where we see that is actually not a very successful model compared to potentially other countries who have legalized or much more regulated, where you cannot advertise or promote these kind of substances.
And I've talked about that with heroin. I was like, if we legalize, I don't think it should be promoted like beer. I think we messed up with alcohol. Alcohol shouldn't have been promoted the way it is.
Yeah.
And that's what you're saying.
But then also,
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to say, but then the issue also with steroids is because it is a medicine as well, how would you deal with that? Because you couldn't also expect from doctors to make a decision as to who they would want to prescribe, because, a doctor is there to support someone who is experiencing health issues or the prevention of illness and so on. So how would you be, how would you be able to regulate that? So it brings a lot of things. There's a lot of interesting thinking involved. I don't have the answer now as to, what the best model would be, but I definitely don't think that criminalization is the way to go.
I always, anything, when we go to prohibition, if it's something that is desirable enough to go into a black market and that market will exist, then it's a bad idea. We got to get rid of the black market. But also, so I did not realize when you said that California has, anabolic steroids are decriminalized or legal in California?
Oh, no. I was talking about cannabis.
Oh, you're talking about cannabis. So you're saying cannabis, they're having more problems with cannabis since legalization?
Yeah, I think compared to other states, but again, let me double check and get back to you about this. But from my understanding is because of the model they have, because it is so, basic, almost treated like alcohol, in the way it's advertised and promoted and so on, that they're actually experiencing some negative effects of the model that they have adopted compared to other states that have a more regulated approach. But let me.
That's what's confusing to me, because for when cannabis is also a lot safer than alcohol, you don't have people driving and getting in horrible accidents on cannabis. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's not nearly like what it is with alcohol. And also, you don't have the all the negative health effects from cannabis. So I'm not sure about. I don't know. No.
Yeah. So okay, let's make sure that we look into that and get back to that about that. But that's from what when talking to colleagues that have an expertise in this area, talking about different kind of policies and how it should be regulated. from what I understood, was that California is not necessarily the best example when we look at other states that have legalized or decriminalized this kind of substance. And I get what you're saying, like, compared to alcohol, there's much less risk with cannabis. But even with cannabis, if you would use it in very high quantities on a young age, there's always things that can develop as well because of that. No substance is risk-free. And the more you use from a substance and the longer you use it for, the higher the risk is that you can develop adverse effects. And I don't want to talk about this too much because it's not necessarily my expertise, but I do think with cannabis that there is a bit of extreme side. So where, back in the old days where this extreme side was like cannabis, you basically turn into a zombie and it's bad for you. There's now a bit of this other extreme and that it says like cannabis is healthy and everybody, all the benefits from cannabis, where there should be a bit of a middle ground for you. Yeah, of course, cannabis can be healthy and can have medical benefits, can actually also have, have pleasurable effects without necessarily experiencing harm. But there are people who are experiencing harm from cannabis as well. So we need to recognize that as well. So it's not all, of course, positive. There are people who are experiencing problems with it as well. And I think we need to be a bit in a middle ground there.
I agree. And I don't think cannabis is a cure all the way that they get very evangelical about it. But again, they're excited because it's finally becoming available for them in a legal format. And I grew up under Prohibition in North Carolina, and we smoked every single day as much as we could afford to buy. It wasn't not available because it was prohibited. It was actually more available. Alcohol was a lot harder to get when we were in high school because a pot dealer didn't care. They didn't have a license to lose if they sold it to you. So I do think that a developing mind getting stoned every day, it's not a great thing. And no drug is. I think we do need, to have our, as our mind's developing, it needs to develop naturally. And I think it goes back to being honest with people about drugs, being honest about their effects.
Exactly.
I was told basically cannabis was right there with heroin and other drugs. It was put up on this pedestal with those drugs. So when I tried cannabis and it wasn't that bad, I was like, well, what's up with the other stuff? And I started experimenting. And that was, if they would have been honest to begin with, maybe I wouldn't have, maybe cannabis would have been in my threshold. Like, all right, that's good for me. Who knows? But one last thing before I let you go, I just want to go back one more time about this thing in Belgium that it just blew my mind. So you can go to your, I know I already asked this, but you can go to your own gym. Now let me ask you this: if I go to my gym and they say you have to take a urine test, can I just quit the gym and leave? Or is it like, no, now you have to take this?
Well, yeah. So everything is also a bit a question about how it actually works in practice. And I have to say, I don't think the policy has changed yet, but this was when I was doing research, several years ago during my PhD. But I think it still applies. But they can ban you from a gym, but a lot of gyms will not necessarily enforce it. So you're right. So you could go to a different gym, or you could train at home. So the question is, to what extent is it really effective? You could get like relatively high fines. I think that fines was usually could be up to 2,000 euros or something, which is a relatively big amount, paying something like that.
Now, is there jail time involved? Like, say if you don't have the money for the time?
So they can start a trafficking investigation, which I think is pretty amazing, that you test someone for using these substances, and then they are allowed to start a criminal investigations to see whether you're supplying it as well. And in general, we don't. So, the question then becomes, to what extent are a lot of users convicted of supplying these substances as well? But we do see, we see a lot of investigations started that focus on users and seeing whether or not they're supplying. And what we do see is then, I guess the idea is that they potentially could, track down people who are, supplying this on a very large scale. But actually what we see is that the people who get arrested are exactly what you're saying, like these small scale dealers, who are potentially supplying it to support their friends, or because they want to, to cover their own costs of the steroid use and so on. So usually we see that it's not necessarily that effective in actually, tracking down these massive, steroid trafficking networks. But so that can happen in Belgium. But, Belgium is an extreme example in that case.
That's great. It makes me think of, like, if I went to the bar and they tested me and found cocaine in my system and was like, all right, we're doing an investigation. Like, I would stop going to that bar. I'd be like, what?
Yeah.
But that's just something to think about. This is all new to me, everything about this world of enhancement drugs, but it's very fascinating, and all the parallels. Like you said, it's a lot of it's different, but a lot of it. Anytime there's a black market and prohibition, we're seeing a lot of the same things, the same harms that are happening.
Yeah. Exactly. We see, when we compare, we see increase in arrest rates. We see, users going underground, not looking, not accessing healthcare. So we definitely do see similar things in terms of the effects of, criminalization on these kind of substance users as well. But I think also where the difference comes from is just especially when providing care, you definitely don't have to reinvent the wheel, because a lot of treatment potentially could be adopted from, other addiction treatments. But I mean, there are things that are different that you need to pay attention to. And I think that's also important when it comes to this group, because they feel that they often are almost treated like other drug users, where they are different and they do need, to a certain extent, different support as well. And I think and those details are important. If you don't get them right, you scare someone away who's not going to seek healthcare the next time when they need it.
And that's why I think we need to leave it up. We need to get law enforcement out of it, prohibition out of it, and leave it up to healthcare and their patients. Like, talk to your doctor about it. And to me, that's kind of what legalization looks like. Especially with opiates. I've thought all about it. I've had guests that are on who say they think heroin should be available, like at an ABC store. And I've went back and forth about what this looks like. But to me, I think going to a doctor that wouldn't judge you, but that would give you the proper information. But you'd have to go to an actual. You wouldn't be able to just on a whim be like, let me just try heroin. Like, it would have to be a something you were trying to seek out and talk to a healthcare who would give you therapy or offer therapy, stuff like that. And I think it's the same with this. I think prohibition doesn't work, but we got to have a system that isn't. I see America's all about advertisement, right? We advertise pharmaceutical drugs on our company. You have to go to your doctor. Yeah. So we got to get that marketing out of it. This should not be something we're trying to promote and manipulate people into trying.
Exactly.
But if people want to try it, I think it should be your individual right. You should be given all the information about the negative effects. Cigarettes is the best example. We know how many people it kills. We're not outlawing it, but we're giving you the information, and people are quitting on their own. And that's how it should work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's just hard to, I basically agree with you on all the things that you're saying. For me, it's just thinking about, okay, so how would it work in practice? In terms of providing information, but I mean, as steroids are prescription drugs, how would it then work in terms of supplying these substances? Because I can imagine, for a doctor prescribing this would be quite an ethical and moral, boundary. So I wonder, I get what you're saying, but I wonder how that then work with, if we would get doctors on board to potentially prescribe these substances. So it's just something, that we definitely would have to think about how this, should be provided, how information should be provided, and the practicalities with these kind of policies as well.
Well, if you think about it, like with heroin, for instance, a doctor would say, I don't want to prescribe someone heroin because this is a very addictive substance. Yeah. But if the doctor knows that if they don't prescribe it, the person will go to the black market and get something that could contain fentanyl, then the doctor says, all right, because of these facts, I am doing what's best for my patient by prescribing a controlled dose. So I think with the steroids would be the same thing. I disagree with the steroids, but if I know they can go get something unregulated and more dangerous, then I will, then that's where it becomes harm reduction. And that's where a doctor can feel okay by prescribing something they otherwise would disagree with, but they just, for their sake of the patient who has decided for their own selves, they want to do this,
Yeah. But I mean, the thing is, I guess what would potentially happen though, is that I get what you're saying. And I mean, to be honest, and then that doesn't apply for steroids, it applies to other substances as well. I mean, the majority of people who use drugs do not necessarily experience side effects or minor side effects. And they experience a lot of, functional and pleasurable experiences from using their substance use. But I mean, for a doctor, you would still be taking a risk. So and the argument that you made has been made by other health professionals, by other doctors about steroids as well, because I've done some research on court cases, and one of the reasons that was mentioned was exactly what you're saying. Like, I prescribed this not for medical reasons, but I didn't want them to get it from the black market because I knew the quality was low. But I mean, suppose with heroin, if you would prescribe that and that person then overdoses on that, that comes back to you. And I think doctors in general wouldn't want to take that risk. especially, so, I wonder to what extent you would be able to get doctors on board to actually prescribe these substances.
Well, in Switzerland, they've had 0 overdoses on heroin. When it's prescribed and it's controlled, there's 0 overdoses. The same way there's 0 overdoses.
No, I agree with your arguments, but, trying to get people over that fear, I think that would potentially be very hard. I'm just saying, I agree, if you look at the rates, there's a very low risk, but it doesn't mean that there still is that fear within a lot of healthcare professionals that something would happen. And if it happens, because unfortunately we live in a, risk adverse society where we try to do everything, which I don't think is a good development, to prevent risk, right? And I think, that's also where it comes with drugs. You can have all these facts, but I think it will be really hard to convince this group to take that worry away, that if they would prescribe it, in general, nothing happens.
Well, it probably, maybe not like a general practitioner, like a general doctor, but if you had a specific group of doctors that were prescribing heroin and they were not liable, like this is, you're prescribing to addicts, and if an addict overdoses, because we have methadone clinics here, and methadone, people that are taking methadone will relapse from the methadone on fentanyl. The doctors aren't liable for that. Like, they're not getting in trouble because a methadone addict overdosed on fentanyl. And I think it would have to be something like that, where like, if you're treating addicts, you're not responsible if they overdose. Now, if you prescribe something that kills them, I mean, because what you're prescribing should not be enough to kill somebody. But again, this is getting into medical side that I don't know enough about. I do think though that there's a much better way to do it than what we're doing right now, because we're seeing.
I fully agree. But I just try to make the separation. And then I will stop about this. Is that exactly what you're saying? So they're prescribing because someone for an health reason. How do you say it? So they're prescribing because someone is already experiencing issues because of their addiction to a substance. So that's why, substances are prescribed that are, of which we know that there are, have less, side effects and so on. So the reason that they're prescribing is for the prevention of worse things to happen, or the prevention, and to improve their health and potentially support that person to stop using that substance. Here we're talking not about someone having an addiction. Here we're talking about, someone just using this for recreational reasons. So it's a bit of a different game. And I'm just saying, I agree with all the points that you're making. I'm just wondering how that would actually work in practice. That's all.
And trust me, I wonder every day, every time I have a new idea or have somebody else that disagrees with me, I listen to them, I question constantly, what does a world look like? Because in both of our lives, we've never known a world without prohibition.
Exactly.
So I don't know what it looks like. I know that before the U.S. started their version of the drug war in the 30s, doctors could prescribe opiates or opiate addicts opiates, and they were a very small percentage of the society. It's grown a lot, but I don't just blame prohibition. That's globalization and the loss of industry. There's so many factors that play here. So what would it look like if we legalized drugs and we had OxyContin available at over the counter? How many more kids would use that for pain relief versus something more benign and become more addicted? And that's a question. That's why I don't think it should be you go and grab your Vicodin and go play at the counter. But if you're dealing with problems of depression and opiates can help you, well, that's between you and your doctor.
For sure.
So, anyway, we covered a lot. It was so great talking with you. I'll let you go. But thank you so much for being on my podcast.
It was really, I really enjoyed talking to you. And thank you for inviting me. Always happy to come back and talk more about steroids or whatever you would be interested in.
Definitely. We'll do it again. And I'm glad it finally worked out. And thank you so much for letting, we had that first meeting, and then the author, David Poses, who passed away, and they had his vigil, and I got to speak at that. So thank you for that, because I was really wanting to do the podcast, but I was like, it's at the same time, so that worked out.
Oh yeah, of course. But we're here and we did it, and I hope that people are interested in listening to this. I always love to talk about. Well, it sounds so weird, but I really, enjoy do my work, and I love to talk about it. So always happy to do that. And awesome. People, when they're listening to this podcast and want more, feel free to shoot me an email. And I'm happy to provide information.
All right, that's great. Thank you so much for doing this. It was great talking with you.
Thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
All right, sounds good.
See ya.
Bye.
All right, peace, Nicks. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, go to Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star rating, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, the Peace on Drugs Podcast. Go to www.thepeaceondrugs.com/subscribe to subscribe to our newsletter. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast. We're going to let Twiggy Branches take us out of here. Peace out.
What you get. You pay for what you get when you align yourself with the phobia. Just say, bad head, bad high, moves hard, bucket in mind. So I'm sending love east, with cocaine and smile, and watching the sunrise, watching it all, Sunset Boulevard. Are you my doctor? Are you my dealer? Are you my You pay for what you get. You pay for what you get. You pay for what you get when you align yourself with the phobia. Just say, bad head, bad high, moves hard, bucket in mind. So there, sending in a priest, and by the grace of God, I see the sunrise. I see the sunrise. Are you my doctor? Are you my dealer? Are you my doctor? Are you my dealer? Are you my doctor? Are you my dealer? Are you my doctor? Are you my doctor? You pay for what you get. 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 Are you my doctor? Are you my dealer? Are you my doctor?